The air in the emergency room at Metropolitan General was a toxic soup. It was a blend of antiseptic, stale coffee, and the metallic tang of fear. Fluorescent lights hummed a flat, monotonous note overhead, casting a sterile glare on the scuffed linoleum floors and the constant, frantic motion. Nurses and doctors moved in practiced, chaotic orbits, their voices sharp and their faces grim masks of concentration. It was a world of beeping monitors, rattling gurneys, and the quiet, desperate prayers of people on the worst day of their lives. In this world of controlled chaos, Nurse Alara Vance was a ghost. She moved through the pandemonium with a quiet slowness that others mistook for incompetence. Her uniform, always clean, seemed to hang on her as if she were a size too small for her own skin. Her brown hair was pulled back in a severe, functional bun that did nothing to soften the permanent look of apology in her eyes. But it was the limp that defined her. A persistent, uneven gait in her left leg that made her a dissonant note in the ER's high-tempo symphony. It was a visible flaw in a place that worshipped perfection, a sign of weakness in an arena of strength. Other nurses would zip past her, their crisp white shoes squeaking with purpose. Doctors would bark orders over her head, their gazes sliding right through her. She was the limping nurse, the slow one, the one they gave the menial tasks to. Stocking supply closets, changing bedding, cleaning up messes no one else wanted to touch. She never complained. She just nodded, her gaze fixed on the floor, and did the work. The limp was a relic of a past she never spoke of, a physical manifestation of a trauma buried so deep it barely felt real anymore. It was a constant, aching reminder of fire and falling, of a life she had purposefully fled. Here, in the anonymity of the city, she just wanted to be invisible. She was succeeding. Dr. Alistair Finch did not believe in invisibility. He believed in a spotlight, and he made sure it was always pointed directly at him. He was the chief of trauma surgery, a man whose brilliance with a scalpel was matched only by the vastness of his ego. He strode through the ER like a king surveying his domain, his custom-tailored scrubs fitting his athletic frame perfectly. A ludicrously expensive watch peeked from his cuff, a glint of gold and steel that seemed to mock the hospital's strained budget. He had a smile that could charm donors, and a tongue that could flay residents. The staff orbited him in a state of perpetual fear and admiration. The sycophants, like a young resident named Mark, laughed a little too loudly at his cruel jokes. The more principled ones, like Dr. Lena Petrova, a senior attending, simply looked away, their silence a form of quiet complicity. They all knew Finch was a tyrant, but he was a successful one, and success forgave many sins. Finch had a special kind of disdain for Alara. Her quietness irritated him. Her slowness offended his sense of efficiency. But most of all, her limp, her physical imperfection, was an affront to his curated world of excellence. He saw her as a piece of broken equipment, a clog in the otherwise smooth machinery of his department. The day began like any other, a cacophony of sirens, a rush of bodies. Alara was tasked with restocking a trauma bay after a particularly messy GSW case. She moved with her usual quiet diligence, her hands surprisingly steady and sure, arranging sterile packs and checking expiration dates. Her limp was more pronounced today, a dull throb that radiated up from her ankle, a phantom echo of shattered bone and twisted metal. She was carrying a full tray of surgical instruments, carefully balanced, when Mark, the resident, came barreling around the corner, not looking where he was going. He slammed into her. The tray flew from her hands, crashing to the floor in a deafening clatter of high-grade steel. Scalpels, forceps, and clamps scattered across the linoleum like metallic shrapnel. "Watch it!" Mark snapped, not even bothering to apologize. The sound drew Finch like a shark to blood. He was consulting on a chart nearby and turned, his handsome face contorting into a mask of theatrical annoyance. He strode over, his expensive shoes crunching on a stray hemostat. "Vance, what is the meaning of this?" His voice was low, but it cut through the noise of the ER. Everyone fell silent. It was a show. Ilara's face flushed. She bent down, her bad leg protesting, and began to gather the scattered instruments. "I'm so sorry, Dr. Finch. It was an accident. I'll clean it up immediately." An accident, Finch repeated, savoring the word. He looked around at the assembled audience of nurses and doctors. With you, Nurse Vance, incompetence is not an accident. It is a baseline state of being. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the staff. Mark, standing nearby, had his phone out, discreetly filming. His smirk was wide and ugly. Finch pointed a manicured finger at her leg. Is it that leg? Does it throw your balance off? Perhaps we should get you a walker. Or maybe a different job. The janitorial staff is always hiring. I hear a limp is not a disqualifier for pushing a mop. The humiliation was a physical force. It pressed down on Alara, stealing the air from her lungs. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, a mixture of pity, amusement, and relief that they were not the target. She kept her head down, her hands trembling slightly as she collected the last of the instruments. The metal felt cold, dead. I'm sorry, sir, she whispered, the words tasting like ash. You're always sorry, Finch sneered, turning his back on her as if dismissing a piece of furniture. Just be less sorry and more competent. Sterilize those, and try not to cost the hospital any more money today. He walked away, the sycophants trailing in his wake. The show was over. The ER slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but the stain of the moment lingered. Dr. Petrova caught Alara's eye for a fleeting second, a flicker of genuine regret in her expression, before she too turned away, burying herself in a patient's chart. The message was clear. You are on your own. Alara finished cleaning, her movements stiff. She took the tray to be sterilized, her reflection in the polished steel doors of the autoclave showing a pale, haunted face. She hated this. She hated the feeling of being small, of being a target. But the alternative was worse. The alternative was being found, being dragged back into a world of noise and consequence she had nearly died to escape. So she swallowed the shame, pushed it down into the same dark place where she kept the memories of the screaming engines and the smell of burning fuel. She would endure. It was what she was good at. The relative quiet was shattered 2 hours later. A new sound cut through the usual ER din, the high-pitched, multi-toned wail of a mass casualty alert. A 5-car pileup on the interstate. The charge nurse began shouting assignments, her voice strained. Trauma 1, 2, and 3, ready now. Finch, you're in 1. Petrova, you take 2. We have multiple criticals incoming. The doors burst open, and the first wave of paramedics rolled in. Gurneys clattered, medics shouted reports. It was the kind of organized mayhem the ER was built for. Alara was directed to assist in Trauma Bay 1, Finch's territory. Her heart sank. She just had to stay out of his way, be a fly on the wall. The patient assigned to their bay was the worst of the lot. A John Doe, pulled from the wreckage of a car that had been crushed between 2 semi-trucks. He was a mess of broken bones, deep lacerations, and internal injuries. Unconscious, intubated in the field. His body was a canvas of trauma. He was young, maybe 30, with a powerful build that was now broken and violated. Finch was in his element. He moved with an electrifying confidence, snapping out orders for blood, imaging, and surgical consults. Typo neg, 4 units, now. Get me a full-body CT, stat. I want ortho and neuro paged yesterday. Alara did her job. She cut away the man's torn and blood-soaked clothing, her movements swift and practiced, despite her limp. She attached EKG leads, inserted a Foley catheter, her hands working with an efficiency that went unnoticed in the storm of activity. She was a cog in the machine, and for now, that was enough. Finch quickly assessed the CT scans as they came up on the monitor. Massive splenic lac, he's bleeding out into his abdomen. Compound fracture of the left femur, multiple rib fractures, possible C-spine involvement. He was reading the litany of injuries with a detached academic interest. He's going to the OR now, but his pressure is dropping too fast. We need to stabilize him first. But as Alara worked, cleaning a deep gash on the patient's forearm, her fingers brushed against something. She paused. Beneath the blood and grime, there was a faint tattoo on his inner wrist. It wasn't a decorative piece. It was small, precise, and purely functional. A stylized bird of prey combined with a lightning bolt in a dagger. Her blood ran cold. It was a unit insignia. Not just any unit. It was the crest of a Tier 1 Special Operations Group. She had seen it before, stitched onto the uniforms of the men she had pulled from hellfire and wreckage halfway around the world. These men were not normal. Their bodies were not normal. Their injuries were never what they seemed. Her training, dormant for 3 long years, surged to the surface. It was a voice, crisp and clear in her mind, overriding the timid persona she had so carefully constructed. Reevaluate. Look closer. The mechanism of injury is never just the accident. While Finch was focused on the obvious, catastrophic bleeding, Alara's eyes scanned the patient with a new, terrifying clarity. She saw things the CT scan wouldn't show. The faint petechial hemorrhaging around his eyes, a subtle, almost imperceptible twitch in his left eyelid, the slightly unusual, acrid smell clinging to his hair, a scent that wasn't from the car crash. It smelled like an accelerant, but not a common one. Her mind raced, connecting the dots. The unit tattoo, the unusual signs. This wasn't just a car crash. The crash was cover. The real mechanism of injury was something else. A blast wave. He must have been close to an explosion just before the collision. The crash masked the primary injury. And if it was a blast wave, that meant a traumatic brain injury. Not the kind that shows up as a bleed on a CT scan. It was a diffuse axonal injury, swelling on a cellular level. His brain was slowly, silently starting to shut down. The standard procedure Finch was following, pumping him full of fluids to raise his blood pressure before surgery, was actively killing him. The increased pressure would force fluid into his brain, causing a fatal cerebral edema. Just then, a call came through to the charge nurse's desk. A city councilman had been an offender bender and was coming in with chest pains, demanding to be seen by the best. Finch's pager went off. He glanced at it, then back at the dying John Doe on his table. An anonymous wreck versus a well-connected politician. For Finch, it was a simple calculation of priorities. "All right, his pressure is still in the toilet," Finch announced, his patience wearing thin. "We can't take him to the OR like this. He's circling the drain. Let's ship him out. Transfer him to county. They can deal with him. We need this bay for Councilman Davies." The other nurses nodded. It was a cold but not uncommon decision. Triage was a brutal business. But Alara felt a jolt of pure, hot adrenaline. They couldn't move him, and they certainly couldn't send him to county, a less equipped hospital where he would be dead in an hour. She took a breath. She stepped forward, her limp forgotten. "Dr. Finch." He turned, surprised she had spoken. "What is it, Vance? Can't you see I'm busy?" "You can't transfer him," she said, her voice quiet but firm, devoid of its usual tremor. "And you have to stop the fluid bolus. You're going to kill him." The ER went silent again. But this silence was different. It wasn't amusement. It was shock. The limping nurse was challenging the chief of surgery. Finch's face, which had been a mask of impatience, went blank. Then, a slow, dangerous smile spread across his lips. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "I must have misheard you. It sounded like you. A nurse who can barely walk and carry a tray at the same time were giving me a medical opinion. Please, enlighten me. What has your vast medical expertise uncovered that my 2 decades of trauma surgery and a Cornell medical degree have missed?" "He has signs of a blast-induced TBI," Alara stated, her voice gaining strength. "The car crash was secondary. The petechia, the neurological twitch, the elevated intracranial pressure that isn't showing on the scan yet. It's a classic presentation for a delayed cerebral edema from a concussive force. The fluids you're giving him are increasing the pressure. You need to stop the bolus, administer mannitol and hypertonic saline, and induce hypothermia to protect his brain function." She spoke with an authority that stunned everyone, including herself. The words, the protocols, they were muscle memory. The timid nurse was gone. In her place stood someone else entirely. Finch stared at her, his smile gone, replaced by pure, unadulterated rage. Her knowledge was an insult. Her confidence was an act of rebellion. "You are a nurse," he hissed, stepping so close she could smell his expensive cologne. "You do not diagnose. You do not prescribe. You do as you are told. Now, I am ordering you to administer 4 milligrams of lorazepam to sedate him for transport. Do it now." Lorazepam, a benzodiazepine. In a patient with a compromised respiratory drive and soaring intracranial pressure, it would be a death sentence. It would suppress his breathing and mask the neurological signs until it was too late. It was the last nail in the coffin. This was the line. The line between her old life and her new one, between hiding and acting. She looked from Finch's furious face to the still, broken form of the soldier on the table. A man who served. A man who was one of her own. She had made a promise, long ago, in the dust and chaos of a combat zone, that she would leave no one behind. That promise had not expired. No, she said. The word was quiet, but it echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. Finch's jaw clenched. What did you just say to me? I said no, sir, Alara repeated, meeting his gaze without flinching. For a moment, Finch looked as if he was going to strike her. His hand was half raised. Then he seemed to remember his audience. He lowered it, his face a purple mask of fury. You are fired, Vance, he spat, his voice shaking with rage. You are finished. Security, he bellowed. Get this insubordinate, delusional woman out of my hospital. Escort her off the premises immediately, and I want her license flagged for review. She will never work as a nurse again. He turned his back on her, a final, contemptuous dismissal. Mark, get that sedative. Petrova, prep him for transfer. Let's get this piece of trash out of here. Two burly security guards appeared, their expressions uncomfortable but resolute. They each took one of Alara's arms. She didn't resist. As they began to pull her away, she saw Mark approach the patient's IV line with a syringe. She saw Dr. Petrova look down, her face pale, refusing to meet Alara's eyes. She had failed. But as the guards pulled her past a crash cart, Alara's hand darted out. It was a blur of motion, a single, fluid act. Her fingers closed around 2 vials and a syringe, a vial of mannitol and one of hypertonic saline. It was pure instinct. The guards, surprised by the sudden movement, didn't even notice. They dragged her through the ER, past the stunned faces of her colleagues. They didn't let her get her coat or her bag. They pushed her through the automatic doors and out into the cold, drizzling rain of the city afternoon. The doors slid shut behind her, sealing her out. She stood there for a moment on the wet pavement, shivering in her thin scrubs. The sounds of the city seemed muffled, distant. She had lost everything. Her job, her anonymity, her carefully constructed peace. And for what? A man who was probably going to die anyway because she wasn't fast enough, wasn't smart enough to make them listen. The shame from Finch's earlier tirade was nothing compared to the profound, soul-crushing weight of this failure. She had tried to be a ghost, and it hadn't worked. She had tried to be a hero, and it had failed spectacularly. She pulled her collar up against the rain and began to walk, her limp a painful, throbbing testament to her defeat. She had nowhere to go. Back inside Trauma Bay 1, Mark approached the John Doe with the syringe of lorazepam. Dr. Petrova stood frozen, her conscience at war with her career. Finch was already on the phone, schmoozing the councilman's aide. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the air. It wasn't a siren. It was deeper, heavier. A rhythmic, percussive whomp, whomp, whomp that grew louder with shocking speed. The windows of the ER began to vibrate. Nurses and doctors rushed to the glass, their faces filled with confusion and awe. 2 matte black helicopters, sleek and menacing like giant dragonflies, were descending from the gray sky. They weren't heading for the hospital's helipad on the roof. They were landing directly on the 6-lane interstate in front of the building, their rotor wash blasting cars and sending debris flying. Traffic screeched to a halt. The side doors of the helicopters slid open before they even touched down. Figures began to rappel down. Not medics, but soldiers. They were clad in black tactical gear, armed with short-barreled rifles held at a low ready. They moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, forming a perimeter and shutting down the highway as if it were a training exercise. The main doors of the ER burst open, not with a sick patient, but with a wall of disciplined force. A team of 6 soldiers, led by a master sergeant with a face like carved granite and cold, intelligent eyes, entered the hospital. They didn't shout. They didn't run. They moved with an inexorable purpose that was more intimidating than any display of aggression. The chaos of the ER froze solid. Doctors and nurses flattened themselves against walls, their mouths agape. Finch, his phone call forgotten, strode forward, his face a picture of outrage. "What is the meaning of this? This is a civilian hospital. You have no authority here." The master sergeant's gaze swept past Finch as if he were a piece of insignificant furniture. His eyes scanned the room, searching. "We're looking for a nurse," the sergeant said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that carried across the silent room. "Goes by Vance. We were told she has a limp." A collective gasp went through the staff. They looked from the heavily armed soldier to the empty space where Alara had stood just minutes before. Finch's face went pale. "She's not here," Mark stammered, holding the syringe of lorazepam like a talisman. "She was fired." The master sergeant's eyes narrowed dangerously. He keyed the radio on his shoulder. "Sir, Angel is not on site. Repeat, Angel has been ejected from the facility." A voice crackled back, cold and laced with fury. "Find her. Now." Just then, another figure entered through the doors. He was older, in his late 50s, but he moved with the same coiled energy as the soldiers who flanked him. He wore a perfectly pressed Army service uniform, the sleeve adorned with 4 silver stars. General Marcus Thorne, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was one of the most powerful men in the country, and he looked incandescent with rage. His eyes locked onto Finch. You're the doctor in charge here?" Finch, suddenly looking small and insignificant, puffed out his chest. "I am Dr. Alistair Finch, Chief of Surgery, and you are trespassing in my—" "Shut up," the general said. It wasn't a shout, but the command had the force of a physical blow. "My son is in this room, and I have reason to believe you are about to murder him. Where is the nurse they call Angel?" Alara had walked 3 blocks, the cold rain soaking through her scrubs, plastering her hair to her scalp. Each step was a misery. Her ankle throbbed. Her spirit was shattered. A black, unmarked SUV pulled up silently beside her, its tires hissing on the wet asphalt. She flinched, expecting trouble. The passenger window glided down. Inside was the master sergeant, his face grim. "Nurse Vance?" he asked, though it wasn't a question. "General Thorne requires your presence. Get in." Alara stared, confused. I don't understand. Who are you?" "We're the cavalry, ma'am," he said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Your old call sign is Angel, isn't it? We've been looking for you. Now please, get in. We're out of time." The name, Angel. A name she hadn't heard in 3 years. A name that belonged to a different person. A fearless flight medic who rappelled from helicopters into active firefights. A name she thought she had buried forever. Numbly, she got into the SUV. The sergeant handed her a warm, dry tactical jacket. "The general is on site. Captain Thorne is still critical." "Captain Thorne?" Alara whispered, pulling the jacket around her shivering shoulders. "The John Doe," the sergeant confirmed. "Captain Alex Thorne, my team leader." The SUV executed a flawless U-turn and sped back towards the hospital. When they arrived, the scene was surreal. A cordon of soldiers held back a growing crowd of onlookers and media. Alara, flanked by the master sergeant, walked back through the doors she had been thrown out of just 20 minutes earlier. Every eye in the ER turned to her. She saw shock, confusion, and fear on the faces of her former colleagues. She saw Mark, the resident, standing frozen, the syringe still in his hand. She saw Dr. Petrova, her face streaked with tears. And she saw Dr. Finch, standing before the 4-star general, his face the color of ash. General Thorne turned as she entered. The fury in his eyes softened for a fraction of a second, replaced by a profound relief. He walked straight to her, ignoring everyone else. "Angel," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Thank God. Report." The switch flipped. The timid, shuffling Nurse Vance vanished. In her place stood pararescue flight medic Alara Vance. She straightened her back, her limp suddenly looking less like a weakness and more like the battle scar it was. Her voice was clear, crisp, and professional. "Sir," she began, her eyes locking with the general's, "Captain Thorne was exposed to a significant blast wave. Mechanism of injury is primary blast lung and a developing diffuse axonal injury. The trauma from the MVA is secondary. He is experiencing petechial hemorrhaging and intermittent decorticate posturing. indicating rapidly increasing intracranial pressure. The current treatment of fluid resuscitation is contraindicated and actively exacerbating the cerebral edema. He requires immediate administration of mannitol and 3% saline to reduce swelling, therapeutic hypothermia to preserve neurological function, and a neuroconsult specializing in blast-related TBI. He cannot be moved until his ICP is stabilized. She finished her report. The ER was utterly silent. The staff stared at her as if she had grown a second head. They had never heard her speak more than a few whispered words at a time. Now she was delivering a complex medical diagnosis with the unshakable confidence of a seasoned expert. General Thorne listened, nodding slowly. He then turned his gaze back to Finch. It was a look of pure ice. "Dr. Finch," the general said, his voice dangerously quiet, "this woman, whom you fired and threw out into the street, has just given a more accurate diagnosis in 90 seconds than you have in the last hour. She just saved my son's life from your incompetence. From this moment on, she is in complete medical command of Captain Thorne. Her orders are my orders. You will provide her with anything she requires, equipment, personnel, your own goddamn office if she asks for it. Your authority in this matter, and likely in this hospital, is hereby terminated. Are we clear?" Finch sputtered, his face a mottled red and white. This is insane. She's a nurse. I am the chief of surgery. You are a man who is about to kill a national hero because you were in a hurry, the general retorted. He gestured to the master sergeant. Sergeant, secure the patient. No one touches him except Nurse Vance and those she designates. If anyone, including this doctor, interferes, you have my authority to remove them, by any means necessary. The master sergeant and his team moved to surround the trauma bay, their presence an unspoken threat. Alara walked past the stunned Finch without a glance. She went to the crash cart, her movements now economical and precise. She drew up the correct dosages of mannitol and hypertonic saline. The vials she had palmed on her way out were still clutched in her hand. She hadn't even realized it. She approached the bed where Alex Thorne lay. Mark, the resident, was still standing there, looking terrified. "Get out of my way," she said, her voice low and absolute. He scrambled backward, dropping the syringe of lorazepam, which clattered to the floor. Alara injected the life-saving medications into the IV line. She turned to a terrified-looking junior nurse, Chloe, the one who had always offered her a kind word. "I need a cooling blanket and an ICP monitoring kit, now." Chloe, galvanized, ran to get them. Alara was in control. The ghost was gone. The angel was back. Over the next few hours, Alara worked with a focus that was breathtaking to behold. She transformed the trauma bay into a top-tier neuro ICU. She directed the nurses and even a humbled Dr. Petrova with a quiet, unshakable authority. She inserted an intracranial pressure monitor herself, a delicate procedure usually reserved for neurosurgeons, with the steady hand of someone who had done it a dozen times before in the back of a shaking helicopter. General Thorne stood in the corner, watching her, his arms crossed. He had made one call to the Secretary of Defense and another to the hospital board. The fallout for Finch and the administration was already beginning. As the captain's intracranial pressure began to stabilize and his vitals improved, the general approached Alara. "There's more you need to know," he said in a low voice. Alex's car crash wasn't an accident. He was being pursued. He was returning from a deep cover operation with critical intelligence. We don't think it's on a device. We think it's in his head. Alara's eyes widened. "The TBI." "Exactly," the general confirmed. "The people who were after him know his skills. They wouldn't have just tried to run him off the road. We believe the explosion he survived just before the crash was an attempt to induce this exact injury. Not to kill him, but to destroy his memory. To wipe the intelligence he's carrying." He paused, his expression hardening. "And we don't believe it was a coincidence that he was brought to a chief of surgery who was so quick to write him off. We ran a preliminary financial background check on Dr. Finch. He has over $2 million in gambling debts to a very unsavory syndicate. A syndicate with known ties to foreign intelligence services." The implication was horrifying. Finch hadn't just been arrogant or negligent. He had been compromised. He was a paid asset, tasked with ensuring Captain Thorne died on the table or was moved somewhere the enemy could finish the job. The councilman's arrival had just been a convenient excuse. A cold dread washed over Alara. They were still in danger. The enemy had failed once, but they wouldn't give up. The hospital was no longer safe. It was a hunting ground. As if on cue, a flicker of movement at the edge of her vision caught her eye. A man in a hospital maintenance uniform was walking down the corridor, pushing a floor buffer. It was late. The cleaning crews usually worked the night shift. He wasn't looking at them, but his path was taking him directly past the open door of their trauma bay. Everything in Alara's training screamed wrong. The man's posture was too good for a janitor. His hands were clean, and the way his eyes darted around, scanning, not cleaning, he was a predator. The master sergeant, whose name she now knew was Gunner, was posted outside the door, but he was watching the main entrance. This man was using a side approach. "Gunner," Alara said, her voice a sharp whisper. "Man in the gray jumpsuit, 30 meters, you're 6 o'clock. Gunner tensed, his hand moving toward his sidearm. The janitor must have seen the subtle shift. His hand disappeared into the pocket of his jumpsuit. He was still moving toward them, trying to look casual, but his pace had quickened. There was no time to wait for Gunner to react. The man was almost at the door. Alex was vulnerable. Alara moved. It wasn't a thought. It was an explosion of pure instinct. She grabbed a heavy stainless steel instrument tray from the counter. In one fluid motion, she pivoted on her good leg and flung it like a discus. The tray spun through the air, catching the man squarely in the chest with a sickening thud. He staggered back, the wind knocked out of him, his face a mask of shock. The object in his hand, a pistol fitted with a thick suppressor, clattered to the floor. He wasn't down. He snarled, reaching for the weapon. But Alara was already moving. She closed the distance in 3 limping, brutally fast steps. She didn't have a weapon, so she became one. She grabbed a scalpel from the counter as she passed. The assassin lunged for his gun. Alara slammed into him. She drove the heel of her hand up under his nose, a palm strike that snapped his head back with a wet crunch. As he reeled, stunned and bleeding, she brought the scalpel up in a precise, practiced arc, not to kill, but to incapacitate. She slashed the tendons on the back of his weapon hand, rendering it useless. He screamed, a strangled, gurgling sound. Gunner and 2 of his men were on him in a second, piling on top of the neutralized threat, disarming him and zip-cuffing his hands and feet. It was over in less than 5 seconds. The ER staff who remained stared, mouths agape, at the scene. The quiet, limping nurse had just taken down an armed assassin with a tray and a scalpel. The video of Finch mocking her limp began to feel like a dispatch from an alternate universe. General Thorne looked from the subdued assassin to Alara, who stood breathing heavily, the bloody scalpel still clutched in her hand. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with the familiar, terrible rush of combat adrenaline. "The hospital is compromised," the general stated, his voice grim. "We're moving him. Now." He looked at Alara. "You're coming with us. He won't survive the transport without you." "I know," she said, dropping the scalpel into a biohazard bin. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline starting to recede, leaving a cold hollowness in its wake. "Where are we going?" "Somewhere off the grid," Gunner answered, hauling the groaning assassin to his feet. "We have a hard site prepped in the mountains. Let's move." The evacuation was a whirlwind of controlled chaos. Gunner's team collapsed their perimeter, moving Alex Thorne on his gurney, now surrounded by a mobile wall of black-clad soldiers. Alara walked beside him, monitoring his vitals on a portable unit, her hand resting on his shoulder, as if she could will him to stay alive through sheer proximity. They didn't take an ambulance. They loaded him into the back of one of the Blackhawks, which had been reconfigured into a flying medical bay. The roar of the engines was a familiar, comforting sound to Alara, a lullaby from her past life. As the helicopter lifted off, leaving the shocked city hospital behind, she looked down at the sprawling grid of lights. She had arrived in this city seeking quiet oblivion. Now she was leaving it in a military gunship, a fugitive, a guardian, and a target. The flight was short and tense. They flew low and fast, skimming over treetops, the dark landscape a blur below. They landed in a small clearing deep within a national forest, miles from any paved road. A fortified log cabin, which looked rustic on the outside, but was packed with state-of-the-art surveillance and medical gear, was their safe house. Inside, they moved Alex to a reinforced room that had been set up as a makeshift ICU. Alara immediately went back to work, re-establishing his monitoring lines and adjusting his medications. The mountain air was cold and clean, a stark contrast to the stale atmosphere of the hospital, but the tension was 1,000 times higher. They were isolated. They were exposed. The men who sent that assassin are a private military firm, General Thorne explained, his face illuminated by the glow of a satellite map on a laptop. Ex-Special Forces, working for the highest bidder. The intelligence Alex has implicates their employer, a foreign oligarch, in a plot to destabilize the global energy market. It's worth billions. They won't stop coming. Gunnar was setting up defensive positions around the cabin with his small team of operators. There were only 8 of them, including himself. And Alara. "They'll track us here," Gunnar said, checking the feed from a thermal camera. "The transponder on the chopper has to be turned off, but they likely had a tail. I give us 3 hours, maybe 4, before they find us." The waiting was the worst part. The silence of the forest pressed in on them, every snapping twig, every hoot of an owl, sounding like an approaching enemy. Alara focused on her patient. Alex's condition was fragile. The move had caused a slight spike in his ICP, and she was working constantly to manage it. He was still unconscious, a ghost in his own body. She found herself talking to him, her voice a low murmur under the hum of the equipment. "Just hang on, Captain. We're almost there. Just a little longer." Hours passed. The sky outside began to lighten, the first hints of a bleak gray dawn filtering through the trees. And then it came. A single, sharp crack from the woods. A sniper. One of Gunnar's men on the perimeter went down. The radio crackled to life. "Contact! East side! Multiple hostiles!" The cabin erupted into action. Gunnar started shouting orders, directing his men. The quiet of the forest was torn apart by the staccato rip of automatic weapons fire. Bullets began to thud into the log walls of the cabin, splintering the wood. Alara's world narrowed to the small room and her patient. The sounds of the firefight were a terrifying, familiar soundtrack. She instinctively dropped to the floor, pulling Alex's mattress down with her to give him some cover from stray rounds. A bullet punched through the window, shattering the glass and embedding itself in the wall just above where his head had been. "They're trying to finish the job," Gunnar yelled from the main room. "They're flanking us. They're going to breach." Alara's heart pounded against her ribs. She was a medic, not a soldier, but she had been in enough firefights to know what was coming. They were outnumbered. They were going to be overrun. She checked Alex's vitals. The stress, the noise, the jostling. It was all taking its toll. His pressure was crashing. He was bleeding internally again. "I need to stop the bleeding," she yelled out to the general, who was crouched by the door with a rifle in his hands. "But I can't do it here." Just then, a massive explosion rocked the front of the cabin. The door blew inward, splintered and burning. Mercenaries in tactical gear began to pour through the opening, their weapons flashing. Gunnar and his men laid down a furious wall of covering fire, but there were too many. One of the operators near the door fell, a spray of red painting the wall behind him. Fall back to the med room," Gunnar roared. The general and the remaining soldiers retreated into the fortified room with Alara and Alex, slamming a heavy steel door shut just as the mercenaries swarmed the main living area. The door was reinforced, but it wouldn't hold forever. They started pounding on it, trying to break it down. "Gunnar, are you hit?" the general asked, his voice tight. The master sergeant was leaning against the wall, his face pale. He had a dark, spreading stain on his side. "It's just a scratch, sir," he grunted, but Alara could see it was much worse. "Let me see," she ordered, moving to him. She tore open his jacket. The bullet had gone clean through, but it had likely nicked an artery. He was bleeding heavily. She grabbed a combat dressing from her kit and pressed it hard against the wound. "Hold this," she commanded the general, "as hard as you can." They were trapped. The mercenaries were trying to breach the door. Gunnar was wounded. Alex was dying. It was a nightmare. Suddenly, from the bed, there was a groan. Alex's eyes flickered open. They were hazy, unfocused, but he was conscious. He looked at Alara, then at the door, then at Gunnar. "Report," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "We're under siege, Captain," Gunnar managed through gritted teeth. "We're boxed in." Alex's eyes cleared for a moment. The fog of the injury receded. replaced by the sharp, cold focus of a commander. He saw the situation. He saw Alara trying to save Gunner while keeping an eye on his own monitors. He saw his father, a general, holding a rifle and applying pressure to a wound. And he saw the steel door buckling under a heavy assault. He tried to sit up, a surge of adrenaline overriding his broken body. "My sidearm." "Alex, no," the general commanded. "Lie down." But a new sound cut through the chaos, a high-pitched whine. The mercenaries were planting a breaching charge on the door. "Get down!" Gunner yelled. The explosion was deafening in the small space. The steel door blew off its hinges, flying across the room and smashing into the far wall. Smoke and dust filled the air. 3 mercenaries stood in the doorway, their rifles raised, silhouetted against the light. They had expected to find wounded soldiers. They hadn't expected to find the nurse. The lead mercenary raised his rifle, aiming for Alex on the bed. In that split second, everything slowed down for Alara. She saw the rifle coming up. She saw the mercenary's finger tightening on the trigger. She saw Alex, helpless. There was no time to think. She reacted. Gunner's sidearm was on the floor beside him, where he dropped it when she started treating him. She dove for it. Her fingers closed around the cold steel of the grip. As she came up from the floor, she brought the pistol up in a two-handed, perfectly stable grip. The stance, the breathing, the sight picture. It was as natural to her as breathing. The mercenary fired. The bullet ripped through the air, right where her head had been a second before. Crack. Alara's return shot was a single, precise report that was shockingly loud in the enclosed space. The .45 caliber round hit the lead mercenary dead center in the chest. His body armor stopped the bullet, but the kinetic energy lifted him off his feet and slammed him back into the mercenary behind him. The third man, stunned, swung his rifle toward her. Crack. Her second shot. A headshot. He dropped like a stone, no theatrics, just a sudden and complete absence of life. The first mercenary, winded but alive, was scrambling to bring his rifle back to bear. Alex, with a final, desperate surge of strength, threw a medical monitor off his bed. It crashed into the man's legs, sending him stumbling. It was the opening Alara needed. Crack! Her third shot. Another headshot. The fight was over. Silence descended, broken only by the ringing in their ears and Alara's ragged breathing. She stood there, pistol held at the ready, her body a statue of lethal calm. The timid nurse was gone. The angel of the battlefield was all that was left. General Thorne stared at her, his face a mask of utter astonishment. Gunner, bleeding against the wall, just managed a weak, incredulous smile. "Damn, Angel," he whispered. The immediate threat was over, but they could hear more mercenaries moving outside. Before anyone could move, the roar of helicopter rotors filled the air again. But this time, it was a different sound. Heavier. Apache gunships. And behind them, the deep thrum of Chinooks. The cavalry had arrived. Again. Gunfire erupted outside, but this time it was overwhelming, professional, and brutally one-sided. Within minutes, it was over. A voice came over the general's radio. "Site secured, sir. Hostiles neutralized." They had survived. Alara finally lowered the pistol, her hands beginning to shake uncontrollably. The strength fled her legs, and she sank to the floor, the exhaustion hitting her like a physical blow. She had saved them. The aftermath was a blur. Medics swarmed the cabin, airlifting Gunner and the other wounded soldiers. A specialized neurotrauma team took over Alex's care, their leader looking at Alara with a profound, undisguised respect after the general gave him a brief, intense summary of her actions. They were flown to a secure military hospital, a place of quiet efficiency and absolute security. Days later, Alara stood by Alex's bedside. He was awake now, truly awake. The intelligence he carried had been secured, and the oligarch's plot was being dismantled by intelligence agencies around the world. His recovery would be long, but he would make it, thanks to her. "They told me what you did," he said, his voice still weak but clear. "At the hospital, in the cabin. You saved my life 3 times. "It's my job," she said softly, the old, quiet Alara peeking through. "No," he said, reaching out and taking her hand. His grip was surprisingly strong. "That wasn't a job. You're a warrior." Meanwhile, Dr. Alistair Finch had been busy. Believing Alara and the soldiers were dead in the mountains, he saw an opportunity. He called a press conference in the lobby of Metropolitan General, ready to spin his narrative. He would be the hero who had uncovered a dangerous, unstable nurse and her conspirators. He stood at a podium, his face a mask of feigned solemnity. "It is with a heavy heart," he began, the cameras flashing, "that I must report on the tragic events stemming from the actions of a deeply disturbed former employee, Alara Vance. Her delusional fantasies led to the abduction of a patient and the deaths of—" He never got to finish the sentence. The main doors of the hospital lobby opened. General Marcus Thorne walked in, flanked by a phalanx of stern-faced FBI agents. Behind them, a recovering Master Sergeant Gunner pushed a wheelchair. In it sat Captain Alex Thorne, looking pale but resolute. And walking beside him, her head held high, was Alara Vance. Her limp was still there, but now it looked like a mark of honor. The press corps erupted into a frenzy. Cameras swiveled from Finch to the dramatic new arrivals. Finch froze, his mouth hanging open, his face draining of all color. He looked like he had seen a ghost. Several ghosts. General Thorne walked directly to the podium, gently moving Finch aside as if he were a piece of trash. "Dr. Alistair Finch," the general announced, his voice booming through the lobby's sound system, "is a traitor and a liar." He gestured to an agent, who connected a laptop to the large screen behind the podium. "He was paid a substantial amount of money by a foreign power to ensure my son died in his care. We have his bank records, we have his phone records, and we have this." He hit a key. A recording began to play, its audio piped through the speakers. It was Finch's voice, panicked and greedy, talking to one of the mercenary commanders. "Is it done? Is the asset terminated? And the nurse?" "We're moving on the safe house now. It'll be done. Just make sure the money is wired." The recording ended. The lobby was dead silent. Finch, exposed and utterly ruined, made a strangled sound of denial. "No! It's a fake! They're framing me!" He tried to run. He scrambled away from the podium, but the FBI agents were on him in an instant. They slammed him against a wall, cuffing his hands behind his back. He started to weep, pathetic, broken sobs of a narcissist whose world had just been obliterated. "You can't do this to me!" he screamed as they dragged him away. "I'm the chief of surgery!" As he was hauled past the crowd, his eyes met Alara's. In her gaze, there was no triumph, no hatred. There was only a quiet, profound pity. He had done this to himself. In the days that followed, the story became legendary. Alara Vance, the limping nurse, was now the angel of Metro General. The video of Finch mocking her went viral, now serving as a satisfying prologue to the story of his downfall. Her former colleagues, including a deeply ashamed Dr. Petrova, offered tearful apologies. Chloe, the junior nurse, hugged her, saying, "We always knew you were special. We were just too scared to say it." The hospital board offered to reinstate her, to give her any position she wanted, a massive raise, a public apology. She politely declined. That part of her life was over. A week later, she sat in a quiet office with General Thorne and a nearly recovered Alex. "The Air Force wants you back, Alara," the general said, his tone formal but his eyes warm. "The pararescue community never forgot you. But we're not asking you to be a PJ again. We want you to build something new." He slid a file across the table. The cover read, "Project Angel, Special Medical Operations Command." "We want you to create and lead a new unit," he continued. "A small, elite team of medics with your skills. A rapid response force for high-stakes extractions and deep-field medical care. Your protocols, your team, your call sign. You'll answer directly to me." Alara looked at the file, then at Alex, who gave her a small, encouraging smile. For 3 years, she had run from who she was. She had hidden her strength, her skill, her scars. She had tried to be small to avoid pain, but pain had found her anyway. Now, she was being offered a chance to not just embrace who she was, but to become an even greater version of it. "I accept, General," she said, her voice clear and steady. The final scene of her old life was walking out of Metropolitan General for the last time. She wasn't being thrown out. She was leaving on her own terms. The sycophant, Mark, had been fired and was facing charges as an accessory. Dr. Petrova had taken over as interim chief, vowing to change the toxic culture Finch had created. As Alara walked across the rain-slicked plaza, Alex was by her side, his own steps still careful, but getting stronger every day. He was assigned as her military liaison for the new program. A black SUV waited for them at the curb, the same kind that had come to her rescue. "Ready for the next fight, Angel?" Alex asked, his eyes twinkling. Alara looked back at the hospital, a place of so much humiliation and unexpected vindication. Then she looked forward, at the waiting car and the unknown future. Her limp was still there, a quiet rhythm to her stride. It was no longer a source of shame. It was a part of her story, a reminder that you can be broken and still be strong, that you can fall and still learn to fly. "I'm ready," she said, and for the first time in a very long time, she smiled. She got into the car, leaving the ghost of Nurse Vance behind forever, and drove off to become the legend she was always meant to be. We really hope you enjoyed this educational piece of content, and hope that you could understand the moral lessons behind it. The story of Alara Vance teaches us a powerful lesson about judging others. People who appear quiet or weak on the outside often possess incredible strength and resilience forged in fires we know nothing about. It shows that true character isn't about status, titles, or a flawless appearance. It's about courage, integrity, and doing the right thing, even when it's hard. Ilara's journey is a reminder that standing up for what is right, even at great personal cost, will ultimately lead to vindication. True strength is not the absence of scars, but the courage to wear them with honor. Doing the right thing always pays off in the end. What would you have done if you were in Alara's shoes? Would you have defied Dr. Finch to save the patient, knowing it would cost you your job? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, please smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Have a nice rest of your day.